In this DVD, I will focus on counterattacks, the clinch, and defending against your opponent's takedowns. In addition to learning the basic techniques, it is also very important that you focus on timing. As you will soon see, timing is very, very important. If your timing is off, utilizing one of the countering measures I lay out could be hazardous. Instead of evading your opponent's attack and landing one of your own, you suffer the hit. Along these same lines, it is very important to develop a keen sense of distance. If you attempt to throw a kick and there is not adequate distance between you and your opponent, again, you will suffer rather than your opponent. If you want to keep a fight standing, it is very important to spend some time on the takedown defense portion of this DVD. It is also important for those of you who would rather take the fight to the ground because the techniques will often allow you to attain the top position, which in most cases is more advantageous to you. The clinch is just as important because it is often a difficult position to avoid. If your opponent is determined to tie you up, you must know how to gain the upper hand. By establishing the holds I've laid out, you create openings to land hard strikes or even take your opponent down. However, if your opponent manages to get a more dominant hold, you've also got to know how to escape. If you fail to learn these defensive techniques, you're basically putty in your opponent's hands. He can take you down, land strikes, all sorts of nasty stuff. If you take the time to master all the techniques I've laid out, in addition to the striking and grappling techniques I've laid out on the other DVDs, you will have a well-rounded game.
Solta. No meio de peidar aqui. Não levanta muito não. Vamos no braço. Vai. Vai pra frente. Vai. Pega logo a minha perna deitada no chão.
I would like to talk for a moment about timing and sense of distance in my fighting style, both of which are very important. For example, when an opponent attacks, I will often use what we call a counter strike. My opponent throws a punch or kick, but I time his movements and hit him with the strike before he can connect with his strike. So I base my strike off my opponent's movements. Another counter is what we call nikiri in karate. With this counter, you defend with your footwork rather than a block. For example, if my opponent throws a strike and I stand right in front of him, I will take a hit. With nikiri, my opponent attacks and I exit to avoid his strike. Having missed his punch, my opponent is left off balance and I am in a good position to fire back with a strike of my own. Just as with countering, nikiri takes exceptional timing. Sense of distance is also very important. I will only move back enough to avoid my opponent's strike, nothing more. If I misread his movement and don't move back far enough, I will get hit. If I misread his movement and move back too far, I will not be in a good position to follow up with a strike of my own. However, it is much easier to read your opponent's movements when you fight at a distance. If you fight up close, you will not see the strike coming until it is too late. This is why I always fight at a distance. When you close that distance, it is very important to do so with strikes. When your opponent attempts to close the distance, you move out of range of his strike and then launch a counter strike. Now, if your opponent manages to close the distance and you don't have the time to get out of the way, then you will execute a block. However, blocking should be a secondary strategy. You always want to utilize footwork first. I always say the best defense is footwork. If you have the strategy of using your arms to block your opponent's attacks, you will be at a much higher risk of getting knocked out or hit. The only time you want to block is when you can't escape using footwork. For example, my opponent throws a cross and I can't use footwork to escape, so I block his strike. He then throws another punch and I block that one. However, if I continue to stand here and block, eventually he will hit me, so I move away from him as quickly as possible using footwork. The greatest defense comes from distance. For example, if my opponent wants to throw a punch, he must enter into my range. However, when he enters in and throws a punch, I extend my range. If he throws another punch and enters, I again extend my distance. If he comes in yet again, then I exit off to the side. I'm always using side-to-side movement in combination with nikiri. When I feel cornered, as a last resort, I will use a block. Now I am going to show you how to use timing in a fight, which is very, very important. We will start with countering a round kick using a cross. In order to apply this strike, you need to train it many, many times. You should train it so much that you do not have to see the kick coming. You feel it coming. You can tell by your opponent's initial movements exactly what he's going to do. When my opponent begins his strike, I enter and counter before he can throw it. Once he begins to move, I move with him. With speed, it looks a little like this. My opponent begins to throw his strike, and I quickly close the distance and strike one of his vital points. Once more slowly. Though he took the initiative with his strike, I am beating him to the punch with my counter strike. Now I demonstrate how to counter an opponent's round kick with a right cross, and then follow up with the sweep. When I strike my opponent, he will get forced backwards. Before he can re-establish his base, I follow up by sweeping his grounded leg out from underneath him.
Aí eu vou mostrar o golpe. Mais uma vez, devagar.
Once more slowly. The technique I show now has the same timing as a counter strike. It is a very common technique in karate, but not as common in other styles. When my opponent throws a round kick, I will switch my stance and enter in with my opposite leg and hand. It is important that the strike is very explosive. It is also very important that you elevate your opposite arm to block. The goal is to land your strike before your opponent can land his kick, thereby reducing all power behind his kick.
Mantendo a distância, rápido.
But in case your timing is off, it is very important to put up your block. This is another technique for evading and countering an opponent's round kick. Reading his movements, I see that he's about to throw a round kick. As a result, I step my lead leg back to evade his strike. It is very important to keep your hips square until you rotate for your kick. If you move your center of gravity as you step back, not only will it take longer to evade your opponent's strike, but you will also lose power in your kick. It is important to move with your opponent. As he enters with his kick, you step back and then throw your kick. Once more slowly. As he kicks, I retract my front leg and throw my kick. Now I demonstrate how to counter an opponent's round kick using a spinning back kick. It is a complex technique. You have to turn and kick to your opponent's stomach before he can land his kick. So your opponent kicks and you turn and kick with him. When you spin, it adds power to your kick. A little faster now to show the movement. Once more, my opponent kicks, and I turn and throw a back kick. Now I will spar with my brother, countering his round kicks using the techniques I just demonstrated.
Mais giro, vai.
In this technique, I step my lead foot to the outside of my opponent's body, leading him to believe that I will throw a round kick. Normally, my opponent will attempt to counter my movement by throwing a jab. However, immediately after stepping my lead foot to the outside of his body, I move to the opposite side of his body. Not only does my footwork cause my opponent to miss with his jab, but it also puts me in a perfect position to counter with a cross. A little faster. Once more slowly. A little faster. Now faster. I do the initial step already knowing where I'm going to go. This is another technique you can use to counter your opponent's jab. It also works well when your opponent doesn't throw a punch. Either way. So my opponent throws a jab and I step to the outside of his lead foot. In addition to removing my head from my center line and causing him to miss his punch, it sets me up to throw a ridge hand strike to the side of his jaw. I can strike with the blade of my hand, or I can strike with the first two knuckles. Once I strike my opponent, I hook my left hand across his body and hook my right hand behind his lead leg. To get the takedown, I push into his chest with my left hand and pull his left leg with my right arm. Now at normal speed. Like I said before, this strike can be done with an open or closed hand. When you strike your opponent's chin, it is very effective. It works great to counter your opponent's jab. You want to hit your opponent's chin with your strike. The technique is applied the same when you're countering the jab as you would when entering with this technique. After landing the strike, one hand goes to his chest and the other hooks around his leg. You can strike with an open hand or a fist. After landing the strike, you immediately take him down.
Jogou o jab, entrei, sempre aprumando o adversário.
After executing the takedown, always end up on top of your opponent. Here I demonstrate how to counter an opponent's rear hook using a straight cross when in opposite fighting stances. To begin, I spot my opponent's hook coming and step my lead foot to the outside of his lead leg. At the same time, I throw a cross straight down the pipe. Because a straight punch has to travel less distance than a circular one, I land my strike before he can land his. Immediately after landing the cross, I follow up with the lead hook to the side of his jaw. Notice how I circle my rear leg around as I throw the hook. This gives me an even more dominant angle of attack, making it more difficult for my opponent to follow up with another strike. Slowly. Now fast. This is the same situation as the last. My opponent and me are in opposite fighting stances, and he throws a rear hook. Spotting his punch coming, I counter with the cross. However, in this situation, my strike forces my opponent backwards. Instead of following up with a lead hook, I throw a front kick, step forward to switch my stance, and then throw another cross. The kick can be to your opponent's stomach or to his face. A little faster. Slowly. In this scenario, my opponent steps forward and throws a cross, and I evade his strike by stepping backward and throwing a cross of my own. This utilizes both timing and distance and works wonderfully against fighters who like to advance when they throw punches. Instead of holding my ground, I will step back and counter. When you throw your punch, it doesn't have to be straight. It can come from over the top. Slowly. Faster. You step back to avoid the strike, and then push off your back leg and throw the punch. Now fast. This is another technique for evading the cross. However, instead of retreating backward, you step off to the side to evade your opponent's strike. At the same time, you counter with the lead hook. Landing the hook will open a pathway for the uppercut. And once you land the uppercut, hook your hand around the back of your opponent's head, pull his body into you, and throw a rear knee to his midsection. Normal speed. Now fast. Once more, slowly. I exit with the hook and then enter with the uppercut and the knee. Fast movement now. This is yet another technique for countering a cross. In this one, my opponent throws the cross and I slide my lead foot back to my rear foot to create distance between us. Once accomplished, I throw a front kick with my rear leg, step my kicking leg forward, throw a jab, and then follow up with a cross. Although my opponent initiated the attack, I am the one landing strikes. A little faster. Now slow. Exit, kick, enter, enter. A little faster. In this scenario, my opponent and me begin in opposite fighting stances. He throws a right cross, and I counter by stepping my lead foot to the outside of his lead foot. This removes my head from my center line. At the same time, I throw a cross of my own, landing to my opponent's face. Although we have already covered this technique, my opponent's reaction is different. Instead of backing away after I land the punch, he drops his elevation and shoots in for a takedown. Opponents will often do this when injured. To prevent him from accomplishing his goal, I position my elbows in front of his shoulders. Notice how this makes it very difficult for him to reach my legs. As he drives forward, reaching, I step back and then turn and pivot around him. Notice how this disrupts his forward momentum. After completing the turn, I push him away from me, land a kick, and then throw a punch. He enters, I defend, kick, and punch. Fast. Now I show how to counter a cross using a spinning back kick. This technique requires more distance between you and your opponent. If you're close, not only will your opponent be able to hit you, but you won't have enough room to land the kick. To prevent the technique from working against me, I will retract my lead leg as my opponent punches to create distance between us. Then I will kick. Slow. And now fast. One more time. I will create space when my opponent throws his punch by retracting my lead leg and then kick. Slow. And now fast. Now I spar with my brother using the countering techniques I just demonstrated. A lot of times when you throw a punch such as a jab, your opponent will drop his elevation to evade the strike and then quickly shoot in underneath the strike and go for a takedown. As long as you perceive his elevation drop, you can counter using this technique. So I throw a jab, my opponent ducks underneath it and shoots in. Having spotted his elevation drop, I slide my lead leg back as I pull my jab back into my stance. At the same time, I pivot on my back foot and throw a rear uppercut. Normal movement. A little faster. Once more, I throw a jab, my opponent shoots in, and I counter with the uppercut. This is another technique for countering a takedown. So, my opponent comes forward to scoop up my legs. To counter, I place one hand on his head and the other hand on his shoulder, slide my lead foot back slightly, and throw a rear knee to his face. If your opponent is especially close when he shoots in, you might need to retract your front leg more in order for the technique to work. This is something you will get the hang of during training. You will develop a better understanding of distance. Let's do it again at normal speed. Now fast. Once more slowly. And now fast. When your opponent shoots in for a takedown, a lot of times you won't have the time or footwork needed to evade his attack. In such a situation, your elbows are very important. When my opponent comes in, I will drive my elbows in front of his shoulders to slow his forward progress. If your elbows are up, there is nothing stopping him from entering and controlling your legs. Your elbows must be placed in front of his shoulders. This stops him cold. Once accomplished, I will place one hand over the other or simply place my palms on the back of my opponent's head. No matter which grip I choose, I retract my hips to create distance. Then, the next step is to drive my knee forward, striking my opponent's midsection or face. Now normal speed. First, block. Slowly, he enters and I block. Then I enter with the knee. Now fast. If your goal is to keep a fight standing, then you need to know how to avoid your opponent's takedowns by sprawling and then working back to your feet. I demonstrate how to do this in the following sequence. In this technique, your arms play a very important role. As my opponent shoots in, I dive both of my arms in front of his near shoulder to stifle his forward energy. For the best results, I cup my arms underneath his body on his torso and paste my torso to his back. As he reaches for my legs, I drive my hips down to the mat. With my upper body driving into his upper body, as my legs go back, his energy is redirected downward instead of into me. Notice how even when I land, I keep my arms tucked under his body for control. To get back to my feet from the sprawl control position, I pull my arms out from underneath his body and place my left hand on the back of his head. By pushing down into his head, I can prevent him from redirecting his energy forward. Remember, where the head goes, the body follows. From there, I pop back up to my feet. Driving your hips to the mat as you sprawl your legs back is very important because it prevents your opponent from latching onto your legs and redirects his forward energy into the ground. If you keep your hips forward when you go down and your opponent is an explosive wrestler, he will be able to latch onto your legs, draw them into his body, and then score the takedown. If your legs are back and your hips flat to the mat, he won't be able to reach them. Now I demonstrate how to sprawl, which is quite different from the takedown defense I have already showed. When my opponent shoots in, I pummel my left arm underneath his right arm. My right arm is to the outside of my opponent's left arm. As he comes forward, I lower my weight onto him and sprawl my legs back. Once accomplished, I reach my left arm underneath his body and obtain control of his right arm and pull it into his body. Hugging my body to his, I reach my right arm over his body and circle around to his back. Notice how my right arm is tight to his body. With my opponent controlled, I am now free to strike. I can punch while kneeling. Or I can come up, keep my hands on my opponent to hold him down, and kick to his midsection. To cause the most damage, you don't want to kick with the top of your foot. You want to kick with the ball of your foot. Now faster.
Segurei. Empurra.
When my opponent shoots in, I block by placing my elbows in front of his shoulders and sprawling my hips back. As I demonstrated before, this sets me up perfectly to throw a knee. However, sometimes my opponent will capture my leg and attempt a single leg takedown. If he places his head to the inside of my body, I will prevent him from accomplishing his goal by driving his head away from me and pulling my leg free. Slowly. So, I block his takedown, knee, push his head away, and pull my leg free. I defend, sprawl my hips back, knee. He grabs my leg, I push his head down, and pull my leg free. A little faster now. This is another technique you can use to defend against a single leg takedown. As my opponent snatches up my lead leg, I push his head away using my left hand. This creates space between our bodies and allows me to wrap my right arm around the top of his left arm, establishing an overhook. At the same time, I circle my right foot to the outside of his left leg. Next, I grab his right elbow with my left hand. Once I accomplish all of these things, I will lift his arms upward using my arms and drive my captured foot towards the floor, breaking his grip. Once more. Opponent enters, I defend. I press on his head, establish an overhook, grab his elbow, lift his arms upward, and drive my foot toward the floor. My opponent grabs the single. I establish an overhook with my right arm, circle my right leg to the outside of his leg, then I control his elbow, pull his arms upward, and step my foot to the floor. Now I spar with my brother using the takedown defense techniques I just demonstrated.
Agora vou explicar pouquinho do quanto é importante.
In karate competition, you do not utilize the clinch.
No karatê de competição, normalmente.
However, in Machida martial arts, our karate, we train the clinch a lot. It is super important to include the clinch in your training because in a real fight where there are few rules, the clinch is very effective for closing the distance and doing damage to your opponent. So I demonstrate several clinch techniques and when they are best applied. If your goal is to strike with punches and kicks, it is best to try to maintain distance. But if you lose that distance, you've got to understand how to establish the clinch and throw knees and elbows. So I highly recommend spending some time with this section. There are many ways to control your opponent in the clinch. You can establish the Muay Thai clinch, which is where you place your elbows in your opponent's chest and cup one hand over the other behind his head. You can also change your grip by cupping your palms together. You can wrap one hand behind your opponent's head and control his far arm by cupping your hand over his biceps. If you have a collar tie and your opponent has a collar tie, you can cup your free hand over his arm for control. You can keep your one collar tie and establish an underhook with your opposite arm. And then you can remove your collar tie and place your hand on the side of your opponent's head to force him away from you. There are techniques you can do from each of these controls, so you should practice them as much as possible to get a feeling for how they work.
Essa.
Now I demonstrate how to throw a knee from the Muay Thai clinch.
A pegada
When you establish this position, you can cup your hands around the back of your opponent's neck, or you can cup them higher up on his head. When you do this, you can really pull his head downward.
não tem força, levanta a cabeça.
He doesn't have enough strength in his neck to resist the pressure you can apply with your arms.
Usar o joelho.
This allows you to drive a knee into his midsection.
Ou ainda, eu posso fazer a pegada aqui.
If you keep your hands clasped behind his neck, you will still have good leverage to pull his head down and land a knee.
Então eu tô aqui na
Once more, you enter and secure control of your opponent's head. You can cup around the back of his neck or higher up on his head.
forte, eu venho para a cabeça.
When you have control, drive in a knee.
Não tem força lá em cima. Meto o joelho. Tempo um pouquinho mais rápido. Agora vamos mostrar
When you establish the Muay Thai clinch, you want to cause as much damage as possible.
o clinch.
So now I demonstrate how to throw a sequence of knee strikes that can score you the knockout.
Só como 2, 3, 4 sequências.
Right after you secure your opponent's head, throw the first knee strike I demonstrated in the previous technique.
A partir do momento que você
Next, pull your leg back, switch the positioning of your feet, and throw a knee with your opposite leg.
você tem condições de voltar.
You can keep on going like this until your opponent manages to escape.
Mais uma vez
Once more from another angle. After you establish the clinch, throw a sequence of knees.
Você tem condições de colocar uma sequência de joelhada.
Faster. Now I demonstrate how to throw a lateral knee.
Lateral.
It's not a technique that a lot of people use, but it is very effective.
Uma joelhada muito eficiente.
To execute this knee, I will establish head and arm control.
Eu venho aqui nessa mão.
I accomplish this by keeping my left hand hooked around the back of my opponent's neck and placing my right hand on his left biceps. Next, I will pull his head down using my left hand and lift his left arm using my right hand. This creates a clear pathway for me to land a side knee to his ribs. So, set your opponent up and then throw the knee.
Como eu expliquei,
Now from the other side, I pull my opponent's head down and lift his left arm. This exposes his left side for the side knee.
quando eu levanto, ele fica exposto essa região aqui. Seguro. Joelhada.
A little faster.
Da pegada de clinch.
Now I will demonstrate how to use the Muay Thai clinch to off-balance your opponent. Sometimes when you establish the clinch, your opponent is very strong. Instead of trying to compete with his strength, I off-balance him using this technique.
Step.
So, I step my rear leg forward and to the outside of his lead leg.
Joelho entra. Você vai dar outro step.
Next, I circle my opposite leg around and pull on my opponent's head.
Joelho entra. Porque o
Notice
step,
how this
quando você
causes
faz
him
o
to
step,
fall forward and to the
o
side,
oponente desequilibra.
totally destroying his
Quando eu faço o
base.
step, e a guarda baixa. Quando eu faço o step, eu entro o joelho. Faço
Also
outro
notice
step,
how it causes his guard to
a
drop.
dele baixou.
Next, I throw a knee strike to his midsection or face.
Vamos fazer aqui mostrando a velocidade normal.
Now, normal speed.
Mostrando de outro ângulo.
From another angle,
Com essa pegada.
I grab him, take a
step,
step to the side, throw the knee.
joelho.
Other side,
Para o outro lado,
knee.
joelho. Movimento.
Now a little faster.
Mais uma vez, devagar.
Once more slowly.
O ponto de equilíbrio
Remember,
tá na cabeça.
where the head goes, the body will follow.
Então, essa
So it is
pegada
very
de cabeça é
important that
super
you have
importante.
good control of your opponent's
Aonde
head.
eu coloco a cabeça, ele vai. Ó. Mais uma vez.
lot of times when you establish the Muay Thai clinch, your opponent will defend by placing an arm across your throat and pushing you away. When he does this, it takes away a lot of your strength. It also makes it very difficult for you to strike with your knee. To counter his counter, I will remove my left collar tie, exit to my right, grab his left arm with my right hand, and then drive his head downward using my left hand. Once I establish this position, I can again throw powerful knee strikes. Once more, I grab, he defends, I escape, and throw the knee. It is important to notice that I am using an arm drag, which means I use my grip to pull on my opponent's arm. Same thing, other side. He defends, I exit, establish my new control, and knee. One more. Normal speed. I move to the side and knee. Faster. Now I will show a striking combination from head and arm control. So I throw a rear straight knee to my opponent's midsection. Next, I step my right foot forward into the outside of his lead leg. Then I use my left collar tie to pull on his head, and at the same time I step my right foot forward and drive my left knee into his left leg. The combination of these actions forces his left leg out from underneath him and causes him to fall forward. As he goes down, I circle around his body and then use his compromised position to drive in a knee strike to his face. Now, faster. Once more slowly. Grab, knee, step. I can use either knee, whichever feels more natural. Faster now.
Levantei, entrei, step.
This technique comes in handy when you secure the clinch and your opponent wraps his arm around your waist, as wrestlers tend to do. Instead of holding on to the Muay Thai clinch, I release my right collar tie, wrap my right arm underneath his left arm, and grab his shoulder with my right hand. This opens up my opponent's left side and allows me to drive a knee strike into his midsection. I rotate my body and pull on his arm, forcing him to move forward and disrupting his balance. Once I complete the turn, I throw another knee to his midsection. Throughout this technique, it is very important to push your opponent's head down. So, I establish the Muay Thai clinch, he grabs around my waist, I establish an underhook on his left arm, knee, change my grip as I step, turn, and then knee. Faster now. Once more slowly. Knee, change your grip, step, and knee. A little faster. Now I show how to close the distance, throw an elbow, establish control in the clinch, and then land a knee. Normally when you close the distance, your opponent will want to grab you to take you down. This technique is the defense. So when I close the distance and throw the elbow, my opponent comes in close and hugs me. From here, I pass my right arm under his left arm and place my left hand on the opposite side of his head. This allows me to dominate his head and arm. Then I step my rear foot forward into the outside of his lead leg, rotate, and knee. A lot of people will try to grab you when you get close. This is especially true when you throw an elbow strike. They will attempt to grab you. Once more, a little faster. slowly showing the movement. I pass, dominate, and knee. A little faster.
Passou e me abraçou. Dominei o braço. Rápido agora.
Now I spar with my brother using the clinching techniques I just demonstrated.
Quando a luta chega no clinch de
A lot of times when you tie up with your opponent, you will end up with an overhook and an underhook, and your opponent will end up with an overhook and an underhook. Since you both have the same grips, this is a neutral position. In order to obtain a dominant position, you must eliminate your opponent's underhook.
aqui nós temos 50%, 50%
From here I have all sorts of options.
vai da estratégia da luta, né, de quem puder vazar a guarda do adversário. Quando eu coloco as minhas duas mãos por dentro,
Why? Because when I get underhooks with both of my arms, I can lock my hands together behind his back.
eu posso fazer.
This allows me to use my strength to break him down.
Estou ganhando a posição aqui. Porque eu estou por dentro, eu estou mais forte. Aqui eu posso fazer força, quebrar ele. Posso
I can lift him up.
levantar ele.
There are multiple things I can do from here because I have a dominant grip.
Já dominei a pegada.
When both you and your opponent have an overhook and an underhook, you both have the same options.
50-50.
In order to eliminate his underhook, you must use what we call pummeling. So I pummel my right arm underneath his left arm to establish an underhook. However, as I do this, my opponent pummels his left arm underneath my right arm, establishing an underhook on my right side. So again, we are both in a neutral position.
Aqui
So now we pummel faster, and eventually I dominate and establish double underhooks.
eu tenho
This position is a lot better for me because I have a dominant grip, more options. He is on the outside, which theoretically makes him weaker. So when I lose the pummel and both of my arms are to the outside, I need to obtain a better position. If you can't pummel your arms back in because your opponent's grips are too tight, one technique is to wrap your arms around the outside of your opponent's arms and then squeeze your arms together to break his grip. As his hands break apart, you pummel one of your arms underneath his arm and establish neutral control again. The second escape begins the same as the first, by wrapping my arms around my opponent's arms. However, instead of breaking his grip, I step my rear foot forward into the outside of his lead leg and trip or throw him to the mat. This of course requires very fast movement because I have lost my dominant control. If I delay, my opponent will use his dominant grip to take me down. This is the reason why it is so important to always maintain dominant control while in the clinch.
Então, mostrando mais uma vez.
One more time.
Pegada aqui.
This position here is neutral, 50-50. I have one underhook and my opponent has one underhook. I have various attacks I can utilize and my opponent has those same attacks.
Depois do momento
Now if he pummels both of his arms underneath my arms, he has dominant control.
fora a pegada, eu vou ter que ou me afastar dele o máximo.
From here I have to get my grips far away and try to pummel one of my arms underneath his arm.
Então tentar uma técnica de sacrifício, como eu falei ainda.
Or I can wrap my arms around the outside of his arms, step behind his lead leg, and throw him.
Uma técnica
Whichever technique I decide to utilize, I must be quick before my opponent can use his dominant position to attack.
aqui vamos
If you delay, your opponent will get the upper hand because he is much stronger with double underhooks. Here I demonstrate basic pummeling, which happens a lot in fights. My goal is to win the pummel by establishing double underhooks. Here I won. When you tie up with your opponent in a neutral position in the clinch, there will be very little distance between you to strike.
Você tem poucas opções.
Most of the time, both you and your opponent will be standing upright, battling for dominant control.
Normalmente,
However, if your opponent gets his hips too far away, then you have an opportunity to land a knee strike. This is the reason why it is important for you to maintain a solid base while pummeling for control in the clinch. I am dominating his underhook arm, and he is dominating my underhook arm.
e aqui, ó, eu vou dominar aqui
The only real striking options from this position is to attack your opponent's lower body. So, I will kick my opponent's shin with the ball of my foot.
e vou chutar a canela dele, ó. Vou chutar.
Sometimes I do this in order to take my opponent down, and other times I do it to force my opponent to move his hips backward, which opens up other opportunities.
Ou pra até me afastar dele.
So, there are a few striking techniques you can do from close range. The second strike I will do from this position is a foot stomp. I lift one leg up and then drive my heel down into my opponent's toes.
Essas são as técnicas que a gente está
It
mostrando.
is also possible to land a knee to your opponent's thigh from this position.
Você ainda pode usar, como mostrei há pouco,
If you land the strike and your opponent moves his hips back to avoid another shot, then you can now target his body with a knee strike.
colocar um joelho dentro. Mostra aqui do outro lado. Mostrando mais uma
Other
vez.
side now.
Pegar a posição, vou chutar a canela dele.
I can kick to his shin,
Chutar a canela dele, me posicionar e pisar no pé.
and I can stomp on his toes.
Posso pisar o pé dele, sempre pisando em cima dos dedos. Um pouco acima dos dedos.
If he backs his hips away to avoid your strikes, then you have the space you need to knee his chest or stomach.
Joelhar na barriga.
Now I will show a movement that is very common in sumo, wrestling, and mixed martial arts when in the neutral tie-up position.
Sumô,
Again, both my opponent and me have an overhook and an underhook. I place the back of my left hand to the inside of his right leg, and as I lift that leg up using my hand, I pull his opposite shoulder downward using my right arm. So, you do two movements at once. One arm lifts your opponent's leg, and the other arm pulls his shoulder down.
rotações.
You secure, enter, and pull.
Outra baixa.
When you execute this technique, you can either fall down on top of your opponent or remain standing.
Segurou. Entro aqui e puxo. Aqui. Como eu posso ficar em pé? Ou posso cair já abraçado passando a guarda. Movimento um pouquinho mais rápido. Vai mais, vai mais. Puxei. Aí.
I can fall here
Posso cair aqui ou aqui.
or here.
Se eu quiser, posso
If I
ficar
like, I can stay here.
do outro lado.
With my right arm, I pull down on my opponent's shoulder. With my opposite hand, I lift his right leg.
Essa entra na perna.
I can either fall with my opponent and obtain side control, or I can remain on my feet.
Fiz a pegada. Puxo.
Now I demonstrate a wrestling takedown that is executed from an over-under body lock.
Essa é uma queda muito utilizada.
Notice how I'm gripping my hands together in the small of my opponent's back. It is also important that I use my elbow to clamp down on my opponent's underhook.
Step.
From this position, you step your rear foot to the outside of your opponent's lead leg. It is a crucial movement that a lot of people do wrong. So I step my rear leg behind my opponent's lead leg and then use my control of his upper body to force him back into my leg.
Essa perna vai entrar assim. Segurou.
I accomplish this by rotating my body in a counterclockwise direction. So I pummel for position, which is very common in wrestling, establish an over-under body lock, tighten my elbow down on my opponent's underhook, step forward, and bump him so he sits back on my leg and trips to the mat. As my opponent sits down on my leg, that's when I fall. One step and then the takedown. Notice how when I fall, I step my leg behind both of my opponent's legs. This will prevent him from stepping and re-establishing his base. Now I show a takedown that involves a knee strike. It is important to notice that I have changed my grips from the previous technique. I wrap my left arm around my opponent's underhook. Instead of clasping my hands together behind my opponent's back to secure a body lock, you want to make sure that your grip is nice and tight. Your direction also changes.
E entro. Vou entrar dessa forma, ó. Para trás.
Instead of tripping your opponent forward, you trip him backward.
Para trás. Então entrei. Domina esse braço. Joelho.
I step my rear foot behind my opponent's lead leg and then sit back, rotate, and pull him into me so that he trips in the opposite direction.
Mais uma vez.
Once more slowly.
Dominei a pegada aqui. Dei uma joelhada para abrir o caminho.
I step my rear foot behind my opponent's lead leg and then sit back, rotate, and pull him into me so that he trips in the opposite direction. Here I show a takedown that requires you to force your opponent to step forward. From over-under control, I will rotate my body in a clockwise direction and pull him into me, causing him to step his rear foot forward into the outside of my lead leg.
Puxar ele para cima de mim.
Notice how this positions his lead foot between my legs.
Quando eu puxo ele para cima de mim, sobrou essa perna. Eu vou entrar nessa perna, ó.
To get the takedown, I drive my weight into him. A little faster. Once more, but slowly. I rotate and pull my opponent into me, causing him to step forward. With his lead leg now between my legs, I hook my lead leg around his right leg to prevent him from stepping back and reestablishing his base. To get the takedown, I drive my weight into him. Another angle. I pull my opponent off balance and then enter on his leg.
Sobrou essa perna.
This is another technique where I force my opponent to move, and then I use that movement to my advantage and execute a takedown. First off, I need to disrupt his balance and base. I accomplish this by stepping my lead foot behind me, pulling on his body using my underhook, and pushing on his body with my overhook. Keeping our bodies close, he is forced to step his rear foot forward in order to maintain his balance. Once he steps forward, I drop my left hand to his right knee to block it and drive up into him with my underhook. A little faster. I pull him, hit his knee, and then drive my underhook into him to trip him to the mat. This is very important. Block the knee and lift at the same time. Now another angle.
Puxei. Bato.
This takedown is executed from over-under control in the clinch. To begin, I hold my opponent close to me. I dig my left hand into the crook of his right arm and then force him away from me. At the same time, I cinch down tight with my underhook, wrapping my arm over his shoulder. Once accomplished, I pivot on my right foot and rotate in a counterclockwise direction, applying downward pressure on his arm with my right hand. Next, I drop my chest and weight over his back, wrap my left arm around the right side of his head, wrap my right arm underneath his left arm, and clasp my hands together. To get the takedown, I pull him into me. After he has gone down, I circle around to his side. It is important to notice that I'm hugging his body with my right arm. This prevents him from rolling or standing back up. From here, I can begin to strike.
Mais uma vez. Ele tá me segurando aqui. Tá fazendo força. Eu empurro. Eu empurro. Mid back. Puxa.
I'm holding my opponent. I hook his arm. At the same time, I cinch down tight with my underhook, spin around, and then wrap my left arm around the right side of his head. It is important to notice how I do this from this angle. Now I will spar with my brother using the techniques I just demonstrated. Now I show a takedown for when you reach your arms underneath your opponent's arms, known as double underhooks, and grip your hands together behind his back to secure a body lock. When I get this position, I don't like to step behind my opponent for a takedown. I will demonstrate why. If my brother gets double underhooks and steps behind me, he can execute a takedown, but it is dangerous for him as well. For example, if I'm a judoka, I can use his position to execute a takedown by wrapping up his head and throwing him. So this is why I don't step behind my opponent in this fashion when I secure a double underhook body lock. I much rather use the double underhook body lock to lift my opponent up and then take him down. So I pummel my arms underneath his arms, and from here I will lift him up and take him down. As I lift him, I use my knee to help elevate him even higher off the mat, and then I rotate and dump him down. A little faster. I pummel in, and then I lift and take him down. Once more on the opposite side. I pummel, pick him up, and dump him. A little faster.
Esgrimei. Agora. Esgrimei. Agora vamos mostrar.
Now I show some defensive techniques that you can use when your opponent secures an advantageous position while in the clinch. This is important because you won't always be able to get the upper hand, and if you don't know how to get out of these sticky situations, you can take a lot of damage. First off, posture is very important when you're trapped in the Muay Thai clinch. If you're hunched forward with your head down, you have no strength, and your opponent can capitalize on your positioning by throwing a knee strike. If possible, you want to tighten your neck and look up. And even better than looking up is getting one arm to the inside of your opponent's arms. You always want to fight for posture, but expect a battle. If you try to pummel an arm to the inside of your opponent's arms, he will try to maintain his dominant position by tightening his elbows together. If your opponent's grip is strong and you can't lift your head, then you want to dive your hips forward into your opponent and clasp your hands together behind his back, securing a body lock. You want to get close to him and then lift. Here my opponent has secured a double underhook body lock. If he grabs low, then he can suck his arms into him, break my posture, and drive me over to my back. To prevent this from happening, I wrap my arms over my opponent's arms into the inside of our bodies. Once accomplished, I will move my hips backwards to break his grip and limit his control. From here, you can execute a throw, but before attempting that, you need to be defensive. You cannot allow your opponent to establish a double underhook body lock and pull your body into him. Once he does this, it will be very difficult to defend against his actions. So you need to wrap your arms around his arms and get your hips back before he can reach that dominant position. Same thing again. When your opponent gets the Muay Thai clinch, you have to control his arms and then pummel your arms to the inside of his arms and move forward. You never want to drop your head low or move backward, or he will throw knee strikes. Here you can see my opponent has locked his hands behind my head and secured the Muay Thai clinch. If I move backward, I will lose strength and he will enter with a knee strike. So, from here I will move forward or try to pummel my arms to the inside of his arms. Now my opponent has secured double underhooks and locked his hands together behind my back to secure a body lock. So I place my hands on his hips and then force my hips back, breaking his lock. These basic defenses for the Muay Thai clinch and body lock are mandatory. I strongly suggest mastering both of them before moving on to more complex defenses. Here I demonstrate a slightly more complex way to escape the Muay Thai clinch. First, I posture up control my opponent's arms, and move into him. Next, I keep one arm on the outside and pummel my opposite arm to the inside of my opponent's arms. Once it is to the inside, I reach it behind my opponent's head and clasp my hands together. Notice how we both have the same grips now. To break his hold, I will look up and drive my left shoulder into my opponent's right elbow. To follow up, I throw a knee to his midsection and then an elbow to his head. A little faster. My opponent has secured the Muay Thai clinch. I posture up, move into him, and pummel my right arm to the inside of his left arm. To break his grip, I drive my left shoulder into his right arm. To follow up, I throw a knee and an elbow strike.
Pouco mais rápido. Vou ficando de lados. Pegou. Domino junto com ele. Vai, força.
Now I show a technique for when you lose the pummel and your opponent secures a double underhook body lock. So I am pummeling and my opponent beats me to the punch and gets underhooks. If I let him suck my body into his, he will be able to do all sorts of nasty stuff. So I wrap my arms over his arms and sink my hips back as much as possible. This puts me into less trouble, but my opponent still has dominant positioning. To eliminate that dominance, I step my left leg to the outside of my opponent's lead leg. Once accomplished, I drop to my left side, forcing my opponent to trip over my leg. As we go down, I rotate my body so that I come out on top when we land. What makes my opponent come with me are my tight overhooks on his arms. If I didn't have these overhooks, my opponent could avoid the throw by releasing his body lock. Now a little faster. Same thing on the other side. We're pummeling and I lose the battle, so I wrap my arms over my opponent's arms and get my hips back as far as possible. Next, I step behind my opponent's lead leg, fall back, and rotate my body so that I come out on top. Now a little faster.
Eu dominei, ele vem pra cima.